Chapter 5, National Income Accounting. This is a chapter that is focused primarily on GDP and how we keep track of our total national economy, how we keep track of our income as a whole rather than individually. We're going to talk about all the different measures of GDP, how GDP works. I've eliminated several of the original slides with this presentation that got into detailed formulas and math. I'm not going to hold you accountable for any of that in this class, but it is all in the book. And I do suggest that you dig into that stuff a little deeper in the book just for basic understanding of it. But once again, I'm not going to hold you responsible for it, but it is good to know. Measures of output. Each good and service produced and brought to market has a price which serves as a measure of its value. Gross domestic product, GDP, the total dollar value amount of all final output produced within a nation's borders in a given time period, usually 1 year. So the GDP for a year is the total dollar value of everything we make. And there's other ways to look at it as well, and we'll get into those. Why final output? GDP measurement excludes intermediate goods. These are things that are used to make the final good. The value added is not included in GDP. The increase in market value of a product that takes place at each stage of production. So when you take a raw material and at each stage of production you add value to it until you finally get your end product, only the end product is included in GDP. Supposedly, all those values as they're added up, that each increase in value is included in the final price. And it does make sense that that's how it would work. International comparisons. GDP is geographically focused. Output produced within a nation's border. This makes it easier to make international comparisons. So how do we compare to other countries in terms of GDP? And in order to make the GDP more comparable, we do a per capita GDP, which is just the total GDP divided by the total population. Because our GDP is so much bigger than every other country, because we are large. And we also have a very high per capita GDP. But if we were going to compare our GDP to, say, Switzerland or a Singapore or a Hong Kong, some very tiny, tiny countries, well, in terms of total GDP, they're nothing compared to us. I mean, insignificant, but in terms of per capita GDP, they're as higher than we are. Because that's the GDP per person. So the GDP, the per capita GDP is the average output per person. It's used as a measure of standard of living. Does not indicate the disparity of output. In other words, if there's a tremendous disparity between the top wage earners and the low wage earners, the per capita GDP kind of levels that out. And a low GDP per capita reflects a lot of, basically, if you have a very low GDP, that makes you a third world country. You're a country that is going to struggle economically and politically, typically. Measurement problems. Non-market activities. GDP does not include unpaid production, work done at home, volunteer work, anything that's off the books. So if you repave your driveway, the value, that's not something that would be personally repave your driveway. That's not something that goes into GDP. Only the price of the cement that you bought would go in, but your labor would not be included. Your labor around the house is not included in GDP. Also not included on this slide is illegal activities, drug activities, what people pay for stolen cars, that type of thing. None of that is included in GDP. Things that happen under the table. So if someone pays you cash for a job and you don't report it on your income taxes, and they don't, if you don't report on your income taxes, that's not counted in GDP either. Real GDP and nominal GDP. GDP compares prices, the total GDP year to year. And what we're interested in is the change in output, not the change in price. So real GDP adjusts for inflation. Where the inflation comes from, there's a video in the class on inflation and how it's calculated and the issues with how it's calculated. That's for a later chapter. We'll get it. We have a whole chapter dedicated to that. But for the sake of this chapter, we need to assume that the inflation, how it's calculated, is somewhat accurate, and GDP adjusted for inflation is the real GDP. Nominal GDP is the unadjusted. The official definitions: nominal GDP, the value of the final output produced in a given period, measured in the prices of that period, current prices. Real GDP, the value of the final output produced in a given period, adjusted for price changes. Once again, calculated for inflation, and usually there's a set year that it'll say compare all years of GDP from 1950 to 2013, all in 2005 dollars. So they tend to normalize everything for 1 year. Computing real GDP. Base year, the year used for comparative analysis, the basis for indexing the price. Once again, just the arbitrary year that we set as the baseline for comparison. Personally, I like the unadjusted number. How inflation is calculated is so arbitrary, and quite often the inflation calculation is controlled by the government in order to pay less for Social Security. Inflation is typically much higher than we are told it is. Once again, because the lower the government calculates it, the lower the Social Security increase on a yearly basis, so they can keep paying Social Security. If inflation was set to its real number, the Social Security increases, the cost of living increase for Social Security payments wouldn't be possible to make those payments. It would be unsustainable over a very short period of time. And essentially we go bankrupt as a country. So we tend to adjust our inflation percentage down from where it really is. So for that reason, I like to look at the nominal GDP. And as you could see, we are currently at about $16 trillion. So you would add some zeros to the end of that. There wasn't enough room for them, so I cut off the last couple. We hovered around 14 during the Great Recession, and we've jumped up to 16 trillion. And the reason we've jumped up is because we printed so many trillions of dollars of money over that period of time. It has not come from increased output. Our output is actually down since the start of the Great Recession. But our GDP has increased because we have inflated our money supply. And as you look over our history, you could see how dramatic the increase in GDP has been since the late 60s, early 70s. And one might argue that since Nixon took us off the Bretton Woods gold standard, that things have really gone up dramatically since then. It'd be interesting to do a study on that. But this is an interesting slide to show how much we have increased recently, and we'll talk more about the gold standard later on in the book. Nominal GDP per capita. Once again, this is the nominal, not inflation adjusted, per capita GDP. You can see we've kind of reached a stopping point in the high 40,000s. We're actually kind of trending down a little bit since this graph was produced. The numbers don't come out every well, they do come out every year, but it takes a while for them to get them. So this is really, even though the last date isn't up there, it's really updated through 2012. And you could see, once again, how much it's dramatically risen since the late 60s. The uses of output. The users of output indicate what mix of output has been selected. So this is answering that original question, what to produce. Consumption, goods and services produced by households. This is about 2/3 of our GDP, household production. Investment, plant, machinery, and equipment produced, about 15% of GDP. Government spending, resources produced by the public sector. This is about 1/5 of GDP is government spending. Earlier in one of the previous chapters, I said government spending is about 40% of our total government. There's a couple different ways to calculate this. 40% of our total economy was the government spending. There's a few different ways to calculate that, because much of the investment income and consumption can be attributed to the government. So there's, once again, different ways to calculate that. The way the book does it, it's about 1/5 of GDP. Net exports, this is the value of exports minus the value of imports. It makes up the rest, which is really a very small percentage, actually. Net exports, we'll talk about that a little more. Goods and services made in foreign lands but purchased here. That's imports. Exports, goods and services produced in the United States but purchased in a foreign land. We add exports to our GDP but subtract imports from our GDP. The difference between exports and imports is called net exports, which is exports minus imports. GDP components. The value of GDP can be computed by adding these expenditures: consumer expenditures, investment expenditures, government expenditures, and then exports minus imports. Measures of income. There are two ways to measure GDP. Measurement expenditures on the demand side, or measure income on the supply side. The total value of market incomes must equal the total value of final output, or GDP. So the total amount of money coming in must equal what's going out in order for it to be a true GDP measure. It's not that necessary that you understand that. But it's kind of, if you look at it on a personal side, you did your personal GDP, you would look at all the money that you spent and all the money that you made, assuming you spent everything you made. In order for this example to work, you have to spend everything you made. So if you took all the receipts of everything you spent and then looked at all the receipts, or your wage, your W-2s, or however your pay stubs, whatever it may be, you total all those up and you total up all your receipts, they should equal each other if you spend everything you make. That's the same thing going on here for our economy as a whole. So this is how you would look at how you spend money versus how you make money. So you look at the C, G, X, and M. We just talked about how that was calculated, and you get a total GDP of 14 trillion. This is actual real data based on 2010 numbers. And if you looked at all the wages and salaries for the entire country, we know this from our IRS tax forms, corporate profits, proprietor's income, rents, interest, and then taxes on output, and then you also have to calculate depreciation, and then there's a statistical discrepancy, and then you get the same $14 trillion GDP. And the statistical discrepancy, basically what that means is when they did all the numbers, it didn't match. So they threw in a random number to make it match. It's kind of cheating, if you ask me. The numbers didn't truly line up, but when you're looking at a $14 to $16 trillion GDP, they're never going to perfectly line up. There's too many variables in the calculations. Measures of income. This is output equals income. The spending that establishes the value of output also determines the value of incomes. We can track the distribution of funds from GDP to disposable income. Once again, this is just kind of repeating what we've already talked about to this point. Moving on. Income summary. Households receive personal income as payment for the resources they own and provide. How do households dispose of their income? They spend, consumption, they save, savings, and they pay taxes. So your personal income, your PI, is C plus S plus T. Your consumption plus your savings plus your taxes.